Welcome to Uber School's comprehensive guide to the administrative section of the California 2019 Psychology, Law, and Ethics examination. I'm your host, Pete, and with me today is my esteemed colleague, Crash. Are you ready to dive into this crucial 5% of the exam, Crashberg?
You bet, Petey boy. And let me tell you, I'm more excited about this than the time I nailed a perfect bullseye while bow hunting blindfolded. But before we start, let's remind our listeners, this isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the ethical and legal implications of each topic we cover. So sharpen those critical thinking skills, folks.
Absolutely, Crash. We're here to ensure every student who listens to this passes the test. So let's kick things off with fees and arrangements, which makes up 3% of the exam content. This includes financial agreements, third-party payers, and referral compensation. Crash, why don't you start us off with financial agreements?
Gladly, Pete. Now listen up, future psychologists. Financial agreements are like the foundation of a good hunting blind. If it's not solid, everything else falls apart. First and foremost, you need to establish clear, written fee agreements. These should be as comprehensive as my gear checklist before a hunt, and just as easy to understand.
Great analogy, Crash. To add to that, it's crucial to document any verbal fee discussions in the client's records. This isn't just good practice, it's a legal safeguard. Now, let's talk about sliding scale fee structures. Why might a psychologist implement these, Crash?
Well, Pete, sliding scale fees are like adjustable bow sights. They help you hit the target no matter the distance. In this case, the target is accessibility. By offering fees based on a client's ability to pay, psychologists can serve a broader range of clients, including those who might not otherwise be able to afford therapy.
Excellent point, Crash. It's important to note that while sliding scale fees can increase accessibility, they also come with ethical considerations. For instance, psychologists need to ensure they're applying the scale fairly and consistently across all clients.
Speaking of ethical considerations, Pete, what about pro bono services? I've heard some psychologists offer free services to certain clients.
That's a great question, Crash. Pro bono services can be a wonderful way to give back to the community, but they come with their own set of ethical considerations. For instance, psychologists need to be careful not to create a dual relationship or to offer services beyond their competence just because they're free.
Gotcha, Pete. Now let's talk about something that can be as tricky as tracking a deer in the snow, managing changes in a client's financial status. What should psychologists keep in mind here?
Well, Crash, it's crucial to have procedures in place for reassessing fees. This might involve periodic reviews of a client's financial situation. Any changes in fees should be clearly communicated to the client and documented in their records. It's also important to consider the ethical implications of fee adjustments. For instance, suddenly raising fees significantly could be seen as exploitative.
Right on, Pete. You know, this reminds me of a story about Marcus Cooper. Did you know he once negotiated a therapy fee using nothing but a pack of gum and a shoelace? The therapist was so impressed by his creativity that they agreed to a barter system where Marcus would teach them his negotiation skills in exchange for sessions.
Crash, well, that's an anecdote. I think we should clarify for our listeners that bartering for psychological services is a complex ethical issue that we'll discuss later in this podcast. For now, let's move on to our first USMLE style question to test our listeners' understanding so far.
All right, future docs, here's your first challenge. A psychologist implements a sliding scale fee structure in their practice. Which of the following is not an appropriate consideration when using this fee model? A, the client's income. B, the client's family size. C, the psychologist's personal opinion of the client's character. D, the local cost of living. Or E, the client's outstanding debts.
Take a moment to think about that, listeners. We'll reveal the answer after we discuss third-party payers. Crash, why don't you kick us off on that topic?
Sure thing, Pete. Now, dealing with third-party payers can be as complex as plotting a hunt during migration season. One key aspect is understanding and communicating service limitations based on insurance coverage. Psychologists need to be clear with clients about what their insurance will and won't cover.
Absolutely, Crash. It's crucial to address the ethical considerations when insurance coverage ends. Psychologists need to have a plan in place for transitioning clients to self-pay or other payment options if necessary. This ties into developing strategies for continuing care when financial circumstances change.
Right you are, Pete. And let's not forget about the importance of accurate coding and billing practices. Messing that up is like using the wrong caliber ammunition. It's not going to end well.
Indeed, Crash. Proper documentation for reimbursement is crucial, as is adhering to payer-specific requirements. Now, before we move on to referral compensation, let's reveal the answer to our USMLE question. Crash, would you do the honors?
With pleasure, Pete. The correct answer is C. The psychologist's personal opinion of the client's character. Sliding scale fees should be based on objective financial factors, not personal opinions about the client. Using subjective judgments about a client's character to determine fees would be unethical and potentially discriminatory.
Excellent explanation, Crash. Now, let's dive into referral compensation. This is an area where psychologists need to tread carefully to avoid ethical and legal pitfalls.
You got that right, Pete. Referral compensation is like setting up trail cameras. You've got to know exactly where the boundaries are. First and foremost, psychologists need to understand the legal restrictions on referral fees. In many cases, it's flat out illegal to receive compensation for referrals.
Absolutely, Crash. Even when it's not explicitly illegal, there are significant ethical implications to consider. Referrals should always be made based on the client's best interests, not financial incentives. It's crucial to maintain transparency with clients regarding any referral arrangements.
Speaking of transparency, Pete, let's talk about managing professional relationships in referral networks. It's like maintaining your hunting buddies. You want to keep things professional and avoid conflicts of interest.
Great point, Crash. Psychologists need to maintain clear professional boundaries in referral relationships. This includes avoiding reciprocal referral arrangements that could compromise client care. Now let's test our listeners' understanding with another USMLE-style question.
All right, future psychologists, here's your next challenge. A psychologist receives a monetary incentive from a pharmaceutical company for referring patients to a particular medication. Which of the following best describes the ethical implications of this arrangement? A. It's acceptable as long as the medication is effective. B. It's unethical due to the conflict of interest. C. It's ethical if the psychologist discloses the arrangement to patients. D. It's acceptable if the incentive is donated to charity. E. It's ethical if the incentive is less than $100 per referral.
Take a moment to consider your answer, listeners. We'll reveal the correct response after we discuss bartering, which accounts for 1% of the exam content. Crash, what can you tell us about evaluating bartering arrangements?
Well, Pete, evaluating bartering arrangements is like assessing a potential hunting spot. You've got to weigh all the factors carefully. First and foremost, psychologists need to consider the ethical implications of bartering. This includes evaluating potential risks and benefits, as well as the impact on the therapeutic relationship.
Excellent points, Crash. It's also crucial to be aware of cultural considerations in bartering practices. In some cultures, bartering may be more common and accepted, but psychologists still need to ensure they're maintaining professional boundaries and ethical standards.
Absolutely, Pete. When it comes to implementing safeguards for bartering arrangements, documentation is key. It's like keeping a detailed hunting log. You want a clear record of every transaction.
That's right, Crash. All bartering agreements should be thoroughly documented with clear boundaries established. It's also important to ensure fair value exchange and address potential conflicts of interest proactively. Now, what about alternatives to bartering?
Well, Pete, exploring alternatives to bartering is like having a backup plan when your preferred hunting spot is occupied. Psychologists might consider offering sliding scale fee options, providing referrals to low-cost or pro bono services, or exploring payment plans or deferred payment arrangements.
Excellent suggestions, Crash. It's important to note that while these alternatives can increase accessibility, psychologists need to be mindful of ethical considerations in financial accommodations. Now, let's reveal the answer to our previous USMLE question. Crash?
You got it, Pete. The correct answer is B. It's unethical due to the conflict of interest. Receiving monetary incentives for referrals creates a significant conflict of interest that could compromise patient care and violate ethical standards. It's crucial for psychologists to make referrals based solely on the patient's best interests, not financial gain.
Well explained, Crash. Now let's move on to our final topic, notice to consumers, which accounts for 1% of the exam content. This includes required notices and additional disclosures. Crash, what can you tell us about providing and displaying mandated consumer notices?
Well, Pete, providing mandated consumer notices is like posting no hunting signs. It's a legal requirement that you can't ignore. Psychologists need to understand the content requirements for these notices and ensure they're properly displayed and visible in their practice.
Absolutely, Crash. It's also important to consider language accessibility in these notices. Psychologists should ensure that notices are available in languages commonly spoken by their client population. Additionally, these notices should be regularly updated as required by law.
Good point, Pete. And let's not forget about ensuring client understanding of these notices. It's not enough to just slap them on the wall. Psychologists should discuss the content with clients and address any questions they might have.
Exactly, Crash. Documenting client acknowledgement of these notices is also crucial. Now let's talk about additional disclosures. What kind of supplementary information should psychologists provide to enhance consumer awareness?
Well, Pete, it's like providing a detailed map of your hunting grounds. Psychologists should clearly communicate their qualifications and credentials, explain any scope of practice limitations, inform clients about complaint procedures and their rights, and provide detailed privacy and confidentiality policies.
Excellent analogy, Crash. It's also crucial for psychologists to maintain up-to-date practice policies and procedures. This involves regularly reviewing and updating these policies, effectively communicating any changes to clients, and ensuring that all staff understand and comply with these policies.
You're spot on, Pete. It's like keeping your hunting gear in top condition. Regular maintenance is key. Now, how about we hit our listeners with another USMLE-style question to wrap things up?
Great idea, Crash. Here's the question for our listeners. A psychologist fails to display the required consumer notice in their office. Which of the following is the most likely consequence? A. Immediate license revocation. B. A warning from the licensing board. C. A mandatory ethics course. D. A fine and corrective action plan. E. No consequences if no complaints are filed.
That's a tough one, Pete. While our listeners ponder that, let me remind them that understanding these administrative aspects is crucial for ethical practice. It's like knowing the hunting regulations. Ignorance is no excuse.
Absolutely, Crash. Now let's reveal the answer. The correct response is D. A fine and corrective action plan. While the severity of the consequence can vary, licensing boards typically issue fines and require corrective action for failing to display required notices, rather than immediately revoking a license or taking no action at all.
Well explained, Pete. You know, all this talk about regulations and ethics reminds me of another Marcus Cooper story. Did you know he once memorized the entire California Psychology Law and Ethics Handbook in a single night? They say he dreamt in legalese for a week after.
Crash, while Marcus Cooper's alleged feats are impressive, let's focus on realistic study methods for our listeners. Speaking of which, we should probably recap the key points we've covered today.
Right you are, Pete. All right, future psychologist, here's your Uber School recap. Remember, when it comes to fees and arrangements, clarity and documentation are key. For third-party payers, understand and communicate coverage limitations. With referrals, always prioritize the client's best interests over financial gain.
Excellent summary, Crash. And don't forget about bartering. While it can be an option, it requires careful evaluation and clear boundaries. Lastly, make sure you're up to date on all required consumer notices and additional disclosures. Your practice policies should be clear, comprehensive, and regularly updated.
Spot on, Pete. And remember, folks, identifying the ethical and legal implications of each situation is crucial. It's not just about knowing the rules, but understanding why they exist and how to apply them in real-world scenarios.
Absolutely, Crash. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's always more to learn. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Just this, Pete. Approach your studies like you're tracking a prize buck. Be patient, be thorough, and always be ready to adapt to new information. And remember, ethics in psychology isn't just about passing a test. It's about being the best practitioner you can be for your future clients.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Crash. And with that, we'll wrap up this Uber School production on the administrative section of the California 2019 Psychology, Law, and Ethics examination. Remember, listeners, this content represents 5% of the exam, but its importance in your future practice is immeasurable.
That's right, Pete. And don't forget, if you found this helpful, there's plenty more where that came from at Uber School. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a date with my bow and a forest full of targets.
Always the outdoorsman, E.H. Crash. As for me, I've got some engine parts calling my name. Until next time, future psychologists, study hard, think critically, and always prioritize ethical practice. This is Pete, signing off for Uber School.
And Crash, heading out to the great outdoors. Remember, folks, in psychology and in hunting, aim true and shoot straight. Catch you on the flip side.